Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to August's edition of Idaho Department of Labor's Market Insight Series. My name is Will Henneke. I'm the Public Information Officer for the Idaho uh, Department of Labor. I'm your host today. We have also created a digital hub page on lmi.idaho.gov, where all past webinars and presentations are available, as well as a variety of other labor market information resources. Today, labor economist Lisa Grigg will discuss subsections of Idaho's population that are potentially overlooked and underutilized within the labor force. With that, I will let Lisa get started. Lisa?
Thanks, Will. Good morning. So the topic today is going to be on Idaho's marginal labor force. And this is a segment of the population that sometimes gets looked over, as Will kind of said. Um, the Idaho Department of Labor, we have a lot of data of those who are part of the labor force, both those employed and those who are unemployed. But we don't always have a lot of data about those who are not in the labor force at all. And so the question kind of comes up of why is this important and why did I pursue this? Um, we've been in a really tight labor market for the past few years, meaning we've had very low unemployment. I hear a lot of employers still saying that they're having a hard time getting all their positions filled and that it's a struggle. But on the other side, I also hear of a lot of workers who potentially it's taking longer for them to find a job than they expected it to. And they're starting to get a little frustrated, and some of them are actually dropping out of the labor force. And so the question is does Idaho have this large untapped labor force that simply is not connecting between the employers and the employees? And is that something that maybe we can help remedy, which would be mutually beneficial to both sides? If you can increase the pool of applicants, but also provide a bridge essentially to those who are looking for a job but can't find one. Are there resources available to help those? And the other reason I chose this is that surprisingly enough, Idaho Department of Labor actually has a lot of resources to help this population um, reach gainful employment. It's the role of the Idaho Department of Labor is really to take one person from one employment to their next employment. We're a bridge between those two periods of time. If it's not um, if there's a lag in between. And so we're going to kind of explore a little bit about who this population is, how they're defined, and maybe how to connect with them and what sort of barriers might be present so that they could become employable. So let's do a quick definition of terms here before we get going. This is going to be very important for the rest of the presentation. So there are three states of the labor force, as you can see on the screen here. Employed are those with a job. This is the easiest to define. It doesn't have to be a full-time job. It can be 1 hour a week. Mostly you are exchanging services for wages. The unemployed are those who are actively looking for work. And so meaning active, meaning that they are actually taking concrete steps to try to find a job. So they are submitting resumes, they're contacting employers, they're attending job fairs, they're doing what they can. They are also willing and available. That's important, is that it's not something that like, I want a job, but I'm not able to take it for 6 months. You have to be available now. So these people, again, if you've looked for work actively in the last month, you are considered employed if you don't currently have a job. But then there's this third section that's outside the labor force. And this is where the marginal labor force will reside. It's only a very small subset of this section of the not in labor force. And so at any period of time, any person could be any one of these three states. The two states of employed and unemployed together make up the labor force. So a lot of people think of the labor force as those who are working, but it also includes those who are actively looking for work. And that's an important distinction because they're actually included in our numbers of the labor force, even though they're not employed, but they're trying to be employed. And so we consider them active participants. There's no one of these states that is permanent. You could go from any one of these three states in 1 month to any three the next month. However, some of them have more permanence than others. For example, those who are employed in 1 month are about 97% likely to be within the labor force the following month. These are people that are wanting to be in the labor force. They're really not on the border. Those who are not in the labor force, there's actually a large chunk of them that prefer not to be in the labor force. So not all of these people are looking for a job. Some of them are retirees. So the labor force is those age 16 and over. There is no upper limit on the labor force. So it includes people who are in their 80s and their 90s too. Some of these people have no interest in a job. It's not at their point in life. They may also have family obligations. They may be pursuing education. There's other things like that of not a large section of them is actually probably wanting work. But the goal of this webinar is to really kind of talk about that percentage who might be, who's not currently in the labor force, but want to be. And so that's who we're going to be looking at. Another segment of this that you may not think about too much are the prison population that's recently been released. And so they've gone from a state of where they were not available to work, but maybe they haven't started actively looking, but they're starting to think about it. And so they could be a marginal labor force that's not mentioned on this slide as well, as an example. So here's a quick look at how the three labor states kind of line up in Idaho right now over the past 50 years, actually. And so the dark blue bar is those who are employed. The dark gray, it's very slim. You can see a very small section of our population is unemployed. And there's a pretty big section of the non-labor force. And if you look at this overall, you can see that the total population of those age 16 and over in the last 50 years has increased from a little over 500,000 to 1.5 million. You can also see at the same time that unemployed remains a very small segment of this. The largest section are those who are employed, and then unemployed is the smallest. But the non-labor force is actually increasing. You can see that this band is actually getting bigger over the last 50 years, especially when you start kind of in the early 2000s, somewhere in that period, this band seems to be growing at a faster rate than the population in general. And so some of these, this is 500,000 people in Idaho over the age of 16. So you have about 1 million people in the labor force, and then you have about 500,000 who are not in the labor force. And on the right side here, you can see some reasons as to maybe why they're not there. And again, we've kind of mentioned a lot of these. There's also other issues that I haven't mentioned yet. If you can see down there on the bottom, so some of that could be health issues, whether it's them directly or whether like they're caring for an elderly family member or they're caring for kids or they don't have a car or they don't have childcare. There's many different things. Discouraged workers is in there too. These are people who at one point were unemployed and have felt that there was no job for them. And instead of being actively searching for work, now they've dropped out of the labor force and they're frustrated, they're depressed. The unemployed segment is the one that is the most fluid. So it's a very, very small segment, which you can see here, but that is the one of these three labor force states that is most likely to be any other three the next month. So those discouraged workers are certainly going to be most likely part of your marginal labor force, but that's not all of them. Sometimes it's, for instance, can be students who graduated college and they're starting to look for work when they graduate in a few months. And so maybe they're not actively looking, but they're starting to think about the process. Okay, so in further definition here, so the marginal labor force is actually a technical official term by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Think of it more as this is the labor force, this is the population on the fringes of the labor force, not marginal as in second class. This is more of just they're not actively participating, they're on the sidelines of the labor force, but they would prefer to be participants in the labor force. So they've actually not done an active job search over the last month. That would be required to be considered unemployed, but they have done it over the last year. So they have an active job search. Again, we're going to kind of define different because this is the key factor in what makes a marginal labor force versus a person who's unemployed. So that active job search means that you are taking concrete steps to try to get a job. So maybe you're updating your resume, you're going to a job fair, you're contacting employers, you're applying for jobs. If you're simply going on a job board and scrolling through postings, but you're not taking any other actions, that's a passive job search. And I think that's where a lot of your marginal labor force is sitting. They're looking for that right opportunity, but potentially they're not finding it. So again, they're not actively looking. They may be trying to look, they may be, hearing people talk about jobs that are available and trying to be interested, but they're not taking further steps. But then the marginal labor force, you have to only take two simple steps to become part of the labor force. So one is either you get a job, you become employed, right? The other one is that you begin actively searching. So as soon as you go from just scrolling job searchings to applying to a position, essentially that marginal labor force is now part of the labor force, and it will depend what happens in that month if they're employed or unemployed. But it's again, it's fluid, and nothing is permanent, and they can remain out of the labor force one month, or they can be in the next month. So how do we estimate the marginal labor force? This is pretty technical, but just bear with me here. So the U3 is the official unemployment rate. And what this is the percent of those who are unemployed as a percent of the labor force. Remember, the labor force is those employed plus unemployed. And so this is showing you what percentage of that section is unemployed. In Idaho, we've been under 4% for many years. We've hit record lows in 22. We were at 2.7%. We hit record lows in 2019 before that. So we have been seeing that come up a little bit, but we're still a very, very tight labor market. But U3 is the official labor market that you will see mentioned. If you look up top, U1, this is a much smaller sliver. This is those who've been employed for over 15 weeks. So those who are unemployed for over 3 months. On average, I think most people expect that if they're unemployed, they will have a job within 3 months. It's just kind of a standard idea. And I think a lot of people probably stick with that job search at that period of time. Once you get over that period of time, they may continue if they think that there is potential. They may drop out of the labor force and stop actively looking as well. So that U1 is a very, very small portion of Idaho's population. It's somewhere in just around under 2%, I think. So very, very small sliver if you're looking at that. But we broaden when you go down to U4, U5, and U6. These all include the marginal labor force. And so U4, you can see, includes our official rate plus the estimate of those discouraged workers. So those workers who were at one time unemployed still are not employed, but are not actively looking. So there's an estimate of trying to calculate them. And then U5, again, all other people marginally attached. So this is people, again, that could have been students that are now re-entering the labor force, or just a lot of different motion. Maybe their timing changed. Maybe they got a car. Maybe they didn't have access to a car a couple months ago and now they have a car. So that could change their access to the labor force. And then U6 is all these unemployed people, but it also is now including those who are employed part-time for economic reasons. And an important thing about U6 that I want to mention is that this is the broadest, but it also includes some people who are employed. And so most of these people that are going to be included in this section are going to be employed at very much underemployed. So they're going to maybe be working very few hours, or they're going to have very low wages. They're going to be the working poor is kind of what you think of them. Gig workers, freelancers, potentially. Can also be a person who is working a job that is a mismatch with their skills. For example, you could have someone who is, let's say, a dentist, trained to be a dentist, but working as a dishwasher in a restaurant. It can be those kind of people as well, where they're really not living up to where they could be in the labor force. So when we broaden this is kind of the difference it looks between U3 and U6. So U3 is that official employment rate that gets released, the blue bar on the bottom. The 3 little blue circles are showing you the 3 over the last 20 years, the 3 lowest periods point in time. Guess what? We had a very low point in 2018 at 3%. 2019, we decided to take it a little tighter, and we to 2.9. And then we had the COVID pandemic in the middle, kind of skewed unemployment for a couple of years. But then once we hit 2022, we continued to hit a record low again of 2.7%. And you can also see, if you look here, that 2007, right before the Great Recession, was actually very low numbers as well. But we have not been anywhere really near that from 2007 to 2018. But we continue to be in this very tight labor market. That 3.7% you're seeing there at the end, again, is still over 1% lower than the average of this 20-year cycle. If we look up at the U6, at That's the gray bar. So this is that broadened version that includes all your marginally attached plus those who are really underemployed. And the important thing to take away from this is that even though we're still in a very tight labor market, this expands that potential population that may be a target for employers. And if they realize that that population is out there, they may have a better chance if they can connect with them to get that position filled because these are still very low rates. The U6 average you can see was kind of between 9 and 10%. And so we're still under 7, still very, very tight. But if you think about 7% versus 4%, I think that actually may help. And again, this is mutually beneficial for both sides. This is the whole part of this is that if we can connect the employers with these marginal labor force participants, it should be mutually beneficial because the employer will get a worker, hopefully with the skills they need. And on the other side, again, that those people who are unemployed will remain in the labor force, will not drop out, and will be um, productive and happier members of society generally. Okay, so here's the job market paradox. So as I explained, that really tight labor market is frustrating. So it's very low pool of people who are actually really available to work who aren't currently working. I like to tell a lot of my employers that most of the time when they're looking for workers, they're likely going to be poaching them from some other business at the moment, because again, there's just not a big pool of unemployed workers. But if you consider those people who maybe are employed but not employed how they should be, or those who are just not quite ready to take the jump, but they would if an opportunity is out there, those are the ones you need to also consider and try to reach. And so the idea is that employers are struggling, right? They can't fill positions. Wage rates are even if they rise the wages, they can't seem to get enough applicants in certain situations. But the paradox is that the other side, there's friction going on here between it takes two to tango in the labor market between employers and employees. There has to be a match and there has to be a fit, but each has to see the other one. And so if the marginal labor force who is looking for a job doesn't know those jobs are out there or has some sort of barrier that prevents them from applying for that job, maybe they can't do it because of their schedule. Maybe they can't do it because of their skills are getting outdated. Um, so there's other things, and knowing some of maybe why those things might allow both employers and employees to reach each other and be more adaptable and flexible, um, to realize that there may be a little bit of concessions that go on both sides. Okay, so an important thing also about marginal attachment is that not everyone is there intentionally, and some people are there voluntarily, and some people are not. And so when you think about some reasons of why you might be in a marginal labor force, but it's under your own choosing, you could have left to pursue your master's degree. You could have left the labor force to have a child. You could have left the labor force because you needed to have some time to yourself, kind of a reset. People will enter the labor force and exit the labor force as their life priorities change. Even in the same thing, some people will leave the labor force and come back, such as there are people that will retire that will actually come back into the labor force years later, either out of boredom or because their financial situation has changed. They may come in part-time instead of full-time. There may be some switches there. But again, those who are not there under their own choosing, um, you may have some more barriers to work over than those who are there freely. And so some of it can be market timing. It can be the market situation of if their skills are suddenly outdated. If again things change that they had childcare set up and suddenly that falls through, and so now they need to watch over the kids. If they have a disability as well, that can be limiting on some of the employments they can take. But it's an important point to know that a marginal labor force, some of their are there on purpose, and they kind of have more freedom on when they want to enter the labor force or not. And others, it may not have been their choice, and they're just on the fringes of the labor force because they haven't found anything yet that fits what they need. Okay, so we're going to try to estimate a little bit of how many people are in Idaho's marginal labor force. So that 500,000 in the non-labor force is not the marginal labor force. It's only going to be a very small section of that, but that's kind of our total population we're working off of. So looking at US based numbers, again, looking at current labor force flows is not so easy. The data is not easy to get on a statewide basis. So we're going to go with the US basis. We're going to try to transfer it to Idaho and see what happens, just to give you an idea of maybe the size of population we're talking about. So in the US in 2024, the non-labor force, you could see that 94% of them don't want a job, which meant only 6% of them did. But then if we take out of that 6% below, so this is the bottom bar is kind of that little blue bar on the top, over 70% of them actually weren't looking for work in the past year or were unavailable. Unavailable is important because, again, if you're willing to work but you're not available, you're not going to accept a job. So over those 6% that want a job, only about 28% of that 6% is marginally attached. Pretty small number. When we take it to Idaho, here's the best they can do here for estimates. So we had a non-labor force of 555,000. If we take 6% of that, that takes you to 33,000. If you then take 28% of that 33,000 that want a job, it's possibly an additional 9,000 people. And then you can see down below, we're at about 37,000 people who are officially unemployed in the state of Idaho. So this would increase your potential pool of unemployed people by about 25%. It's not huge, it's not monstrous, but again, if you think about there may be opportunity and potential here to snag an employee that has some good skills but may need some help, it may be an option to consider because they're likely out there, but they're going to be hard to reach and they could potentially drop out of the labor force at some point. Okay, so in order to find the marginal labor force, you have to kind of define who they are and are they similar in any capacity. So we're going to kind of look at some of those populations with a general lower force participation rate. A labor force participation rate measures the amount of those who are both employed and unemployed as a share of that certain population. But it's also going to show you that some of them do have barriers, but there's also resources statewide that are out there to help them. And so I was actually shocked. You can see the graph here on the right. I was actually shocked to see the largest portion was other, which encompasses a lot of things. And maybe that's why it's so big. But it's also, these barriers are sometimes out of the control of those people who are in the marginal labor force. So childcare and transportation really tend to kind of show up the most as to why people are on the fringes of the labor force. The next biggest one is those discouraged by job prospects. So again, those are who've done an active search, didn't find anything, maybe went through the cycle of a few times of finding a job, applying, maybe even having an interview, and then not scoring it, and then starting the process again. And so those are your two main, those together make up about 70% of your marginal labor force. And so realizing that there may be opportunity or workarounds on some of this. Those that are discouraged by job prospects really are going to be the most likely willing to take a job when that opportunity arises. If they hear something from a family friend that this well-established company with a great name and reputation is hiring, they may look further into it. But they're also likely going to be, again, depending on their circumstances, they may be a little frustrated and depressed. And again, it may be harder for them to take that first step because some of their self-identity is wrapped up in feeling like they're not enough and that there's nothing out there for them. Those, again, with childcare and transportation, that may be something, again, to think about from an employer's perspective. And that, is this a good employee, but maybe they don't have a car? Is there any way, are there any other resources in the community that could either get them to the business site, or is there a potential for hybrid work or remote work or anything like that that might actually expand that option and that flexibility? So the first demographic we're going to kind of look at here is by age. And age is important because I told you the labor force does not have an upper limit of age. And so as you can expect, as those who approach retirement age, their labor force participation decreases. So if we look here at the total labor force, age 16 up, most of it is the employed, a small little band of unemployed, and then a decent size of it that's not in the labor force. But if we take those age 25 to 54, this is otherwise known as the prime working age group, they have a very, very different look to them. You could see that they have a labor force participation rate of 84%. This is very high, most of which are employed. There's only a tiny, tiny little band of unemployed in there and a very small strip of those who are not in the labor force. But contrast that with those who are age 55 plus. So 55 is not always retirement age, right? But people are starting to think about it. And this is also an age group where people can sometimes feel discriminated against in the workplace, as sometimes their skills don't line up with the most modern technology and the software that's out there. But you can see their labor force participation rate is much lower at 55%. And there's really very little unemployment. It's either you're employed or you're out of the labor force for this age group. And this is an age group that I think that we have started to provide more visibility for, but it's also hard for them to enter. And here at the Department of Labor, actually, we do some workshops and things specifically for some of this age group, such as basic computer skills. So this age group may also have been out of the labor force for a while, potentially, if they decide to come back in. And so we do some workshops, like I said, updating computer skills and resumes and interviewing, and things that really can try to help really any of these age groups. And those who are 16 to 24, we actually have special programs as well for those who are um, maybe didn't finish high school, or who are parenting, or who have a disability. There's funding available for them to try to get them on a track to try to help them out and get them some much needed skills, but also make them employable. Okay, veterans are a group that I actually think we've done a pretty good job of increasing the visibility of. This group sometimes has low labor force participation rates for different reasons than your general population. Some of these veterans have been through things we cannot even relate to in a war period, in a war zone. And so sometimes it's sometimes the veterans, sometimes it's lack of education. Sometimes they completed high school, but maybe they didn't go on, and so they may be limited in some of their, again, employability. Some of them are the working poor. Um, but I also want to mention here that Idaho also does very good at we're giving some preference to veterans. And we actually, in our local offices, we have veteran representatives who are veterans that are there specifically to help veterans, to help veterans navigate their specific instance. The Department of Veterans Affairs is also going to be helpful in this, as they do some career counseling as well. But my main point on this one is, if you look at veterans labor force participation rate in 2013, 10 years ago, of 71%, it was 5% below that general population that was not a veteran. But now it's about equal. And I think there's been more visibility, and there's been more really a push to engage veterans, realizing that they have skills, but that there may be different barriers for them, whether it's mental or physical, or simply being, transitioning from military to civilian life. There are so many different things, but I think that Idaho is doing a good job of really attacking that. And I think that that's helping getting more veterans in the labor force than they otherwise might be without those programs. Okay, and then a couple more demographics here. So the top one, you can see disability. This is age 16 to 64. So this is working age. So this is not, we're not going above retirement age here. This is just working age. By the way, about 70% of your people with disabilities are likely over the age of 65. It's just one of those things that as you age, the disabilities become more apparent. But these are just age 18 to 64. You can see again, those that have a disability compared to those without a disability, there's a significant decrease in labor force participation right here. And even though that 57% is in the labor force, disabled people actually have about an unemployment rate that's twice as high as the general population as well. So even though there's a smaller portion of them in the labor force, there's a larger portion of that labor force in this segment that likely is unemployed and will need additional help potential barriers to overcome. There's many different types of disabilities. There's visual, there's hearing, there's cognitive, there's ambulatory, and they all have very different needs. But I think it's important to realize that some of these people do want to work, but that again, it may not be a huge concession, but again, it can make a difference in these people and whether they stay in the labor force or not. Educational attainment, again, as kind of mentioned, you can see that those with a high school diploma have a much higher labor force participation rate than those without. It goes as your education increases. You are more likely to be in the labor force with the higher education than you are with the lower education. And I think going together with that, you can see poverty again. Poverty has a very low participation rate, and some of that, again, is going to lead to that lack of resources. If you think of that lack of childcare and that lack of um, transportation, it's going to fall likely into this scenario as well. So kind of if you can alleviate one, you might be able to alleviate the other. But again, it may not be so easy to do, and it may not be something that a lot of your marginal labor force may honestly disclose to employers at the very beginning either. And so there may be questions like, how can we help you accept this job? What kind of things would happen here? Just it's something to be aware of, that the resources may be limited, and that again, maybe there's other community resources around. And the last one quickly here for the demographics is females. So males in Idaho with no children under the age of 18 have a labor force participation rate of about 84%. This is 10% higher than those of females with no children. But I also wanted to break it up here for you based on what age those children are, because it does look like it makes a difference. And those with children just under age 6, so who are not yet school-age children, you can see that we lose a little bit of labor force participation rate here. We lose more participation rate when that female has multiple age groups, so both under school age children, but also school age children. If you think about school schedules, they don't often align with an 8-hour work schedule. Your school schedule, let's say, is 9 to 3:30, but you need to be working from 8 to 5. And so you have to figure out before and after. And there's some great resources like Boys and Girls Clubs and things that can help, but not every area is going to have those possible. But also one thing that I really also wanted to mention that I think is fantastic in the data is when you look at those females with children aged 6 to 17, they actually have a slightly higher labor force participation rate than those who are females with no children under 18. And so they do come back. And that's another thing to realize is that, again, sometimes people's timing are why they're not in the labor force, but they will enter and exit the labor force and become part of the marginal labor force as situations change and as time changes and priorities change. Okay, so the real question is the marginal labor force employable? And the answer, you're not going to like me, I'm sorry, but it depends. The marginal labor force has some similarities, but they also are very unique in the reason of why they are in the situation they are. And sometimes they have been out of the labor force for a long time, and now they're thinking about coming back in. They may be a little rusty, and you can see here kind of on the right side that your local offices throughout the state of Idaho for Department of Labor, we are really trying to help both those who are unemployed and those who are thinking about joining the labor force by doing interviewing workshops and resume. You can come in and talk to someone about redoing your resume. You can get computer basics. You can do mock interviews. You can actually come into the Department of Labor and set an appointment and practice an interview. For some of these people who are in the marginal labor force that are maybe discouraged or haven't been participating for a while, it's very hard to market yourself. It's very hard to sell your abilities when you're not totally confident that that's what's needed. And so there's things available, and we're great resources also for employers. We can there are some programs we have that link employers and employees, like such as apprenticeship programs. We also have some programs where we provide some funding for training to kind of help bridge if there's a skill that a worker needs that an employer requires and they don't have. But it's also fair to note that the longer one is unemployed, the more difficult it might be, and the more barriers, at least mental barriers, that might have to be broken down. Okay, so this is just that look at that unemployed segment. Again, that really small segment, but I think this is important because this is the most fluid of the three labor market segments, whether you're employed, unemployed, or out of the labor force. In June of 2025, this is US numbers. You can see that about half of them were those that were unemployed in June of 2025 were still unemployed in July of 2025, 1 month later. But of the other half, you can see that there was equal chances that those people would either become employed or that they would drop out of the labor force. And so the marginal labor force that is recently maybe unemployed, that has dropped out of the labor force, are likely to be more employable than some of those others simply because they haven't been out that long. They're up to date with the technology and the skills. Um, but again, it all depends. But your unemployed group could potentially be the most employable group of your marginal labor force simply because it's been only a short term since they've been in the labor force. Okay, this graph is just showing you quickly a little bit of the health effects of the three different labor force states. This is done by the Department of Health and Welfare. They administer the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. And the bottom, this is the number of adults age 18 and up who are reporting 14 or more days of poor mental health in the previous month, sorry. What you can see here is that those who are unemployed have a much higher level of potential poor mental health than those employed. And if you think about this, this is again, when you're in a job search, it's marketing and sales, and you have to be confident in yourself. But when those opportunities slip away and you don't get selected, you are going to start questioning if you're enough. And so it's just an important thing to know that sometimes this marginal labor force is really going to benefit from word of mouth of, again, fellow friends who hear of jobs. And they're also going to benefit from these employers who are getting their jobs out as far as they can, trying to cast that net as far as they can, because that's probably how you're going to catch some of these people who otherwise may not see it. So again, visibility on both sides. But it is an important thing to note, though, that employment is not just about having a wage. It's also an identity, and it's also a piece of yourself, and it can also wear you down. And so there are aspects there that, again, need to be considered, but it doesn't mean that the marginal labor force is second class. It simply means that there may be barriers, but you may quickly be able to work through them. Sometimes getting a job is enough. Sometimes it may need some more mental help and stuff in there too from going through this strangely stressful situation. Okay, and then I'm just going to kind of wrap up showing you a little bit of, if you go to the Idaho Department of Labor website at labor.idaho.gov, this picture on the right, you will be able to find, and surprisingly enough, like I mentioned, we actually reach out to a lot of those people who might be in the marginal labor force and those populations that have lower labor force participation, because our goal is to increase the labor force participation of Idaho's population. And so you can see here that job search. So the Department of Labor has Idaho Works. This is a job board that is free for employers to post on. It is also free for prospective employees to look. They can upload their resumes. There's sometimes able to use staff to kind of see if your skills align with job postings and get help, said structuring that resume and interviewing. Unemployment services, again, not everyone that's unemployed receives unemployment insurance. It's usually just a very small portion. It's maybe a quarter or a third of those who are unemployed actually receive unemployment insurance. That's also something to navigate, and that's a way to also make sure that you're able to bridge until the next gainful employment. Um, Idaho Launch, there's been a lot of talk about Idaho Launch in the sense of a program that's recently been developed for graduating seniors immediately going on to college. But this is actually Idaho Launch that was formed a few years ago, and this is more for mid-career people who need to change their skills. And so this is potentially some training funds available. If you need to, let's say you have skills in welding, but suddenly you find you need to be a plumber. So if you live in Idaho, work in Idaho, you may be able to take advantage of these funds. Um, and then it just can, like I said, apprenticeships, you can connect employers who are needing maybe to build a pipeline. This is really more of a long-term view, a very structured skill building that's done internally. And so if there are specific skills that employers need, setting up an apprenticeship may get them that skills, but also, again, you may get that marginal labor force who sees this opportunity to potentially have a path for skillful employment. Again, we can connect you potentially with that. Veterans, you see that down here as well. And able to work is really the last one that I want to mention, and that is specifically for those with disabilities. And it's meant to help reduce barriers. If, for instance, your desk needs to be a certain height, or if um, you need some additional help. And then leading into that, also the Idaho Division of Vocational Resources rehabilitation is phenomenal for this kind of thing, because this is what they do. They are there to help counsel people who have disabilities to get employed, and they have some programs available that can help additionally as well. So definitely reach out. But there are many ways that hopefully the Idaho Department of Labor and a lot of our state partners are able to, our goal is to reduce that marginal labor force and those who are out of the labor force and increase those in the labor force. It's better for the economy, it's better for employers, it's better for workers. So if we can do that, we've done our job. And so with that, I'm just going to close, but I do want to conclude with it is beneficial on both sides, but it's not going to be real easy to find the marginal labor force sometimes. Again, without them being actively job searching, their contact information may not be present and available. And so if they realize potentially that there's resources available and they connect with those resources connection could also connect them with an employer. And it may be something to consider to both have employers connect and those unemployed and marginal labor force as a networking tool. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Will and see if we have any questions.
Okay, Lisa, we actually have three. Okay, so let's start with Delaney. She would like to know if the growth in non-labor force has anything to do with baby boomers retiring?
Absolutely. So the baby boomers are a very large generation. And when we look at um, those over at the age of 65, 20 years ago, well, 10 years ago, it was like 16% of the population, and now it's 22% of the population of those 16 and over. And so you are absolutely seeing part of that large generation is part of the reason why that is happening. And so they're the large scale generation. That's a 20-year span that generation encompasses. But the youngest of them were born in 1964, and so they are just over 60. So there is potentially still some more of them that are working, but maybe retiring, and the generation behind them is smaller. So that is definitely a part of it.
Okay, our next question comes from Earl, and I'm glad you mentioned the disability stuff there at the end, because Earl says he's blind, so perhaps the slide showed the information and he just wasn't able to read it. He would like to know if you have current percentage info for state and national demographics on working age persons with a disability.
Um, that's a really good question. So there's an estimate that around 14% of Idaho's population has a disability. And those who are working age, we could certainly find that data. It is around half of the labor force participation rate of your general population. So if you're general, I think it's around 40% for some of them, but it all depends on what demographic we're looking at. If we're looking at 16 or over, if we're looking at 16 to 64, if we're looking at the prime working age, it's all going to be different. But there are resources. The Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes some of that data. And if you reach out to me, I would be happy to find that for you and help you locate that. But there's certainly some data out there.
Tara is a vocational rehab counselor working an adult corrections caseload, constantly referring people to the Department of Labor job seeker services, yet few follow through due to fear of stigma, rejection, anxiety, mental health, etc. What do you suggest to help them get in the door to access the help that the Department of Labor offers?
That's a really tough question. I mean, the Department of Labor is starting to reach out and work with uh, re work with some of that population, but there's always going to be some friction there because there is going to be some stigma that there's simply employers that will not hire people that have a felony on their record, unfortunately. But it's knowing how to navigate around those. But it's also, again, this population is likely to have, they're going to need some additional support of mental health, maybe substance abuse. They need a support system underneath them. And it's not as simple as, releasing them and saying, here you go. It's kind of like veterans. When you think if you go from a military life to a civilian life, this is a very, very different and overwhelming, probably. And I think that, my suggestion would be to make sure they have a family support system and maybe a legal support system that's following them and checking up with them and following their progress and trying to keep them motivated, believing in them, right? I mean, there's a lot of these populations, I think that if they believe in themselves that they can do it, they will do it. If they don't, that's when you're going to see them fall out of the labor force.
Okay, questions are flying in now. We got a couple more here. Matthew would like to know if trends show youth engaging more in employment over time, or if I'm I'm assuming this is in tongue in cheek, if they're still sitting in the basement.
So, youth labor force participation rate is declining a bit over time. But I also want to say that it's not just because they're in the basement. Part of it is when you think of a lot of these high schoolers now are taking additional like dual credit classes. They have a higher load to some of them graduate with an associate's degree practically by the time they graduate high school. So when you think about that, that actually creates less availability for working. Um, but I think there's also it's it's it is in a group that has a higher unemployment rate too than the general population. So whereas our general population has an unemployment rate of under 4%, our teenagers 16 to 19 are going to be like 13 to 14%. And what that means is that they try, but and then they may give up quickly. And so again, I think that is a group that there is potential for to increase, but labor numbers are showing that participation rates in that group have been decreasing over time.
Okay, Julie has a follow-up question about the baby boomers that you talked about a minute ago. Regarding the number of people moving into the state, how is it measured for impact on the labor force? Does that come from Department of Licensing data or more survey-based?
It's survey based. So your labor force data comes from the 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 CPS survey. Um, CES in Laos. And so it is survey based. And so we have estimates from the US Census of kind of what those age groups look like that are migrating into Idaho. We really have all age groups, but we're getting a lot of very young, 20 to 30-year-olds as well. These people tend to be more mobile. Um, but it is certainly all survey based, unfortunately, possibly, open to error. But it's the best numbers we have. And when we're looking at sometimes it's a trade-off of timing, and then these numbers end up getting revised in the future. But they are, again, it's going to be based on survey. So there could be a lag of, when that survey happens and when they move, they may show up in a different state survey. Um, but but we try to catch it as much as we can. And again, it's statistics, and it's there is some partial error, but it's the best we've got at the moment.
Okay, and Mary uh, is wants to know what changed since 2013 to bring veteran employment rates up to equal with non-veteran populations. Was there a significant event or a notable factor?
Good question. There has been a lot of push, at least for public treatment to kind of give veterans preference over this time period. And so that doesn't mean they get the job. What it means is that um, with a veteran's preference, it may mean you get an interview. It may mean that you're not guaranteed this position. You still have to work at it, but you may have more a possibility to make yourself visible to an employer. And I think that's actually made quite a difference. But I also think, like I said, that nationally, it's not just Idaho, but nationally, we realized in the Great Recession that a lot of our veterans at that time had much lower labor force participation rates than the general population. And there was this big push of saying, these are the people that protect our country, that serve our country, and we need to serve them. And so I think this is a population, I think this is a success story, honestly, of realizing that, every veteran's situation is unique. Um, but I think it's one that nationally there's been more attention paid to. And I think more employers are saying, I would like to employ veterans. There's also tax credits and things for those employers that employ veterans. And so I think it's a joint effort of both visibility, but also providing employers some additional incentives to hire veterans.
Okay, that brings us to a close. Lisa, thank you very much. That was great information, and thank you for taking those questions there at the end. We appreciate your time and your research.
Thank you, everyone. And if there's more questions, again, on the labor force, you can always go to the website. There's also the lmi.idaho.gov website. This is labor market information. That's what the LMI is for. It will give you statistics on wages and occupations and demand and population forecasts and all kinds of really good information to have in your back pocket as well.
Okay. Lisa.Grigg, Grigg, at labor.idaho.gov. Best way to get a hold of you, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for attending. Our next webinar will be on September 30th. Labor economist Seth Harrington will be presenting on poverty and the cost of living. To register for that webinar or others, please navigate the Department of Labor's calendar of events. And for more information, you can find that at labor.idaho.gov. We would also like to remind you that the Idaho Department of Labor has many services geared for job seekers, employers, but it also includes free access to labor market information, like Lisa was just talking about, lmi.idaho.gov. Thanks again for attending. Have a great rest of your day.